You know, on podcast days, I feel like I drink so much water. I'm like, oh, this is so annoying. I'm drinking all this water. And I'm pretty sure I'm just drinking a regular amount of water instead of just
Yeah.
my normal, like 2, maybe 3 glasses a day.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know what it's like to be hydrated. No, that's not true. Once a week, I know what it's like to be hydrated.
Welcome back to another episode of Is Fitz Happy? I'm Luke.
And I'm Emma.
And this week we're discussing Chapter 13 of Ship of Magic, Transitions, which starts off with Brashen. Right in the morning from his long talk when he was drunk with Althea from last night.
Right.
He wakes up on Paragon.
Well, morning, quotes.
It says morning sunlight had penetrated the thick panes of the bay windows, so...
That's, I mean,
morning. Just not the crack of dawn, you know?
Yeah, like a real sailor should, according to Paragon, I think later.
Right, yeah. So he wakes up and he swings his feet out of the hammock and he thinks guilty. He was guilty of something. Spending all his pay when he had sworn that this time he would be wiser, yes. But that was a familiar guilt. This was something else, something that bit with sharper teeth. Oh, Althea. The girl had been here last night begging his advice, or he had dreamed her, and he had given her his bitterest counsels with not a word of hope or an offer of help from him. He tried to shrug the concern away. After all, what did he owe the girl? Nothing. Not a thing. They hadn't even really been friends. Too big of a gap in status for that. He had just been the mate on her father's ship, and she had been the daughter of the captain. No room for a friendship there. And as for the old man, well, yes, Ephraim Vestred had done him a good turn when no one else would, had let him prove himself when no one else would. But the old man was dead now, so that was that. Besides, bitter as the advice had been, it was solid. So, he is feeling a little bit of guilt for how he spoke and how he gave that advice, and what advice he gave to Althea. Remember, it ended with Althea asking, then what can I do different? And Brashen said, be born again, but as a male.
Right. And I think this little tirade of Brashen is his way of trying to get away from feeling the guilt. There's a lot of excuses as to why it's not really that big of a deal. Like Althea and he and Althea aren't even that close. And sure, he liked her dad, but he's gone now. And what does he really owe her? And was it really that unfair of him to be so coarse? It's what she needed to hear. And I just think it's really interesting to see this inner working of how he goes through his guilt and the different layers of like what guilt means to him and how comfortable guilt seems to be on him.
Something that he's had to wear all of his life, because I'm sure he felt guilt and shame from his family,
right?
Or his youth.
Right. Yeah, which, I think something about Brashen that's really interesting is he's such a flawed character, but in a different way than like our Fitz character is. I think Fitz also kind of deals with a type of addiction to the skill, but Brashen has this different addiction that feels more real world, and there's more guilt with it because unlike magic, there's not really like a fantastic outcome. It's not like Brashen wasting his money away on alcohol and drugs is making the world a better place in any capacity. So there's no real room to be like, well, sure, it's not the best for my health, but at least it's doing something good. There's not even that layer. So we really get a character who is suffering with that struggle of living through addiction.
Right. And the interesting about this is, at least to me, Hobb presents alcoholism as not a thing. Like, you can't be addicted to alcohol. It's just a thing that sailors do.
Right.
And in this port, we see Brashen drinking pretty much every day, all of his money away. And it's said from Kennet and from everyone else around Bingtown that all the sailors just get back to port and then drink. That's basically what they do. And then they go back on the ship and they sail for, 6 months, and they come back and they drink a bunch, which, doesn't necessarily mean you're an alcoholic, but there's aspects of that in there.
Right. I mean,
and then later on, like you said, we see him lapse back into his Sinden and his drug use, which happens once he's on the slaughter ship, I think.
yes. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting journey that will be, I don't want to say fun because it's a little dark, but like it'll be interesting to watch Brashen go through, especially with the lens of him fighting urges and seeing how people in this world treat things and how Brashen is living through it. And I think, like you said, there's not necessarily something wrong with like at the end of a long voyage going to get drink. But when you're like Brashen, where he literally doesn't have a penny to his name anymore because he never saves, he's always spending it on drink. And he doesn't have a place to sleep. He has to sleep in an abandoned old ship because he's choosing to spend that money on alcohol instead. And I don't know, I think Brashen as a character is really interesting to me for that reason, that he's a lot less pretty, I guess, not physically, just like as a character, it's not as pretty of a journey for him. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. Although the only reason that he's sleeping in an abandoned ship and not in an inn is because no sailors sleep in an inn, really. Don't they all like just sleep on their ship that they're sailing out with?
I don't think that's true.
Because Brashen does.
Yeah, but Brashen's homeless. Like he doesn't have a family to go back to.
I think a lot of the sailors are pretty much homeless too.
I don't know. I don't think it's like a majority. I don't know. I guess maybe it is. It felt as though it was not necessarily the most normal thing.
Maybe. Yeah, that could be true. We don't have any reference, I guess. No. But he's thinking about, last night and trying to process through his guilt and say like, oh, it's, it wasn't my fault for anything. This is what she needed to hear. And it doesn't matter if it was harsh because we weren't friends. And to be fair, Althea doesn't treat him well. Every time that he tried to have sympathy, she kind of like brushed him off. So when he's drunk, the bitterness kind of comes out, and he is regretful in the next morning. And then he's thinking through trying to process this more and has the thoughts of, if I went back in time, I would do everything prim and proper that my father did. Or father said. I would go schooling, wouldn't touch drinking or Sinden at all. I'd marry who he wanted me to, whatever. I would be the heir eventually, and I would go back in time and redo everything. So his advice to Althea coming from that perspective is like, yeah, of course, like she should do that too. The girl would have to take care of herself. She'd have to go home. That's all there was to it. What was the worst that would happen to her, really? They'd marry her off to a suitable man. She'd live in a comfortable home with servants and well-prepared food, wear clothing tailored especially for her, and go to an endless round of balls and teas and social functions that seemed so essential to Bingtown society and the traders especially. He snorted softly to himself. He should hope for such a cruel fate to befall him. He scratched at his chest and then his beard. He ran both hands through his hair to smooth it back from his face. Time to find work. He'd best clean himself up and head down to the docks. So in his mind, Brashen is like, yeah, that'd be the perfect life. I would love that. I don't want to scrounge for my next meal. I don't want to, look for work. I don't want to deal with anything that I've been dealing with, intermittently in between the Vivacia and under Captain Vestrit.
Right.
So he's thinking, why wouldn't Althea want that?
Right. And I think it's really interesting because he's never had to play the role of a woman in Bigtown, whereas Althea has gotten to see what life is like for men, even if it's in a limited capacity, just the freedom that they get. And she has seen what living as a Bingtown trader woman is. And so
somewhat. She's seen her mother.
Right. But she also attends society and has to live as a prim, proper woman when she's in port.
Yeah, she does mention that she has to go to one event a year or something.
Yes. Yeah. So like
instead of like one a month.
Right. So she does have a different perspective because she knows what Brashen is saying is a cushy lifestyle, that wouldn't be that bad really. But I feel like what's missing from Brashen is the perspective of, yeah, sure, like it would be nice to not have to worry about where your meals come from and have a roof over your head and get nice things. But that's all that she gets. Like there's no freedom to choose where she wants to go. She doesn't even get to own land. All of her property goes to her kids whenever her husband dies. She just has to hope that they like her enough to keep her around. Like there isn't freedom in that. And sure, there's not as much freedom for Brashen if he were the heir, but there's more freedom in his version than there is in Althea's. And I think that blinds him to why Althea wouldn't want it. Because sure, on the surface, like you get everything provided for, what's wrong with that? But he's not thinking about the limits that come with that. And Althea marrying a good, suitable husband, quote unquote, could come with an abusive husband. She could have to deal with a Kyle. She could have to deal with worse than a Kyle. And I don't think that, like, sure, he knows that there are terrible men out there on ships, but I don't think he realizes that that can happen in Bingtown trading homes too.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's frustrating to read his continuous brush off of Althea's want to get away from that as a childish want and to equate it to his want of just being able to party whenever he wants to. And obviously there's more layers. Like we said, he's obviously struggling with addiction now, and it did lead him toward a path that he isn't happy with. But I also think that Brashen falls into this weird routine where he thinks about how much better life could be if he could go back in time instead of focusing on the changes he could make now and following that to become the person he wants to be. He's so focused on like, well, my life's already trash. I guess that's just how it has to be forever, instead of like, what are some steps I could take to maybe change this? And I mean, I say that as somebody who has gone through therapy before, like, so I know that's like a more healthy outlook. So obviously he doesn't have that tool in his toolbox, but
also he's had that outside perspective from Ephraim Vestrit, like say, save a little bit more, whatever.
Right.
And he's eschewed that because he always thinks like there's more time later to do these things, and he falls back on his vices.
Right.
He has had a rough go of it, sailor. I mean, he was sexually assaulted when he was on his first ship.
Right.
And I think a lot of that manifests like, yeah, he's not thinking of Bingtown in general and the dangers there, because all he really knows is being on a ship and those dangers. So I agree with you that he doesn't have the perspective of like, people want different things and there are different dangers for different people.
Right.
And for Brashen, what he knows is the dangers that are out on a ship that is maybe unsavory. And he's like, don't do that. And he's not even thinking of like, what's unsavory in town.
Right. No, it's definitely a grass is greener situation. I don't know. I think, but I mean, I want to be fair and be harsh to him just as much as I'm being harsh to all the other characters too. And I think that's something that I can call out of like kind of toxic behavior of like, well, it's not that bad. She just gets to be a lady. And it's like, have you met Althea? Because I feel like that is the last thing she would want. And you wouldn't have to know her that long to know that.
I feel like that is a very similar conversation that is surrounding with Wintro as well.
Right.
Like, and I know Kyle is toxic as well,
yes.
But also from Veronica's point of view, she's kind of the Brashen in that point of view.
Yes.
Like she's kind of, why wouldn't Wintro want to do this? He's helping out his family kind of thing, like pushing him towards being a sailor when he doesn't want to do that.
Right.
It's just like people want different things, and I don't know.
And yeah, I think this series as a whole in general is so stuck on traditions and what being a good Bingtown person looks like, that they stop thinking about what individual people want and what an actual good person is. Like, it
Right.
doesn't matter if a woman wants to wear pants and be on a boat, or a man wants to wear
Scandalous. Don't show your
robes.
ankles.
A man wants to wear robes and be a priest. Like, I don't know. It's really interesting.
So Brashen greets Paragon, saying good morning. And this is where Paragon's like, afternoon, you mean? And Brashen's like, yep, sure it is. It's about time I head down to the docks, too, to get some work. And asks, well, doesn't ask, but Paragon chimes in saying, I don't think Althea went home because she would have gone this way. So I think she went into town as well, basically telling Brashen what he didn't ask. And Brashen is trying to sound unconcerned and being like, oh, you're talking about Althea, right? And Paragon nods and says, yeah, she was up at first light. And Brashen says that those words sound like a reproach, as if Paragon thinks he's a little bit lazy. Paragon says, I had just heard the morning birds begin to call when she stirred and came out. Not that she slept much last night. Well, she had a lot to think about. She may have gone into town this morning, but I'll wager she goes home before the week is out. After all, where else does she have to go? Only here, I suppose, the ship replied. So, you will seek work today? And Brashen agrees, yep, I have to do that. I think I'll try a fishing fleet, or maybe the slaughter boats instead of the merchants. I've heard a man can rise rapidly aboard one of the whale or dolphin boats, and they hire easy too, or so I've heard. Mostly because so many of them die, Paragon relentlessly observed. That's what I heard back when I was in a position to hear such gossip. That they're too long at sea and load their ships too heavy and hire more crew than they need to work the ship because they don't expect all of them to survive the voyage. Brashen agrees that he's heard those things too. But it's like, what other choice do I have? I don't really have a ship's ticket anymore for all those years. I need a place to rise in the ranks and, progress a little bit. And he says, I wish somebody had told me all those years ago that I should just swallow my stupid pride and go home. So we get Paragon kind of pushing Brashen a little bit towards Althea, and Brashen being like, oh, she's fine. I need to get work.
Yeah, he is not wanting to think about her at all. He's pushing off all mention, and Paragon seems to kind of catch on and drop it.
Yeah.
But
we also get the introduction of the slaughter ships as well.
Yes. Yeah. And how horrible they are.
Yes.
And I mean, they've got to be pretty bad if the pariah has heard how bad they are. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Just that's what he thinks, that there's all there is. And I guess kind of that is. Although you would think some of the other traders would let him on just because they know he has worked under
maybe now, but
Ephron.
It's old trader clique. I don't know.
I guess I feel like Brashen isn't even going to try. He literally isn't. And he's just accepting that, oh, nobody's going to take me. And he's worked pretty hard. I mean, as much as he hasn't thought about the future, he still worked with Ephron Vestrit for several years and was a first mate. People know that in town, and they know that Kyle Haven, is a weirdo and a jerk. So I'm sure they're not going to.
Do they really?
Well, they know he's an outsider. So
is he? I mean, he was born in Bingtown.
Well, he's not an old trader, though.
No, he's not an old trader, but he is a Bingtown person,
I guess.
And he's not part of the clique, sure, but he's married into the Vestrit family, and if they hear that a tussle or an argument happened between Brashen and Kyle, who was obviously chosen by Ephron Vestrit to run the ship and not Brashen, they don't know all the details, and they see Brashen asking for work, it's going to be the same conversation that he was explaining to Althea of what had happened to him all those years ago, where he would go up to somebody like, oh no, check back in a few days, because they don't want to upset any of the agreements or anything like that going down.
Well, hear me out. Kyle's first and second mate seem like they have a pretty bad reputation, or they would.
Second mate, sure. We don't know too much about
his first
Gantry.
Mate is. I thought Gantry is the one who used to be a slaver.
No, it was Torg.
Oh.
Yeah, Torg is the one that's cruel to Wintro, yells at Althea, and knows the slave trade.
Oh, well, either way, I feel like the people he chooses to hang around would say a lot about him, and the people he chooses to hang around
That's fair.
cannot have a good reputation. I just don't believe it. I don't know. I like to believe people know that Kyle is a bad person. I'm going to hold on to that.
Keep it treasured in your heart. So Paragon is very bleak about the prospects of a butcher ship and says it's, super dangerous, you can get infected, whatever, and paints a very vivid picture, which Brashen replies to, saying, "You're so encouraging, but what choice do I have? None at all." And Paragon laughs. "How can you say that? You have the choice that eludes me, the choice that all men take for granted, so that they cannot even see that they have it." "What choice is that?" Brashen asked uneasily. A wild note had come into the ship's voice, a reckless tone like that of a boy who fantasizes wildly. "Stop." Paragon spoke the word with breathless desire. "Just stop." "Stop what?" "Stop being. You are such a fragile thing. Skin thinner than canvas, bones finer than any yard. Inside you are wet as the sea and as salt, and it all waits to spill out from you any time your skin is opened. It is so easy for you to stop being. Open your skin and let your salt blood flow out. Let the sea creatures take away your flesh bite by bite until you are a handful of green slimed bones held together with lines of nibbled sinew. And you won't know or feel or think anything anymore. You will have stopped. Stopped." "I don't want to stop," Brashen said in a low voice. "Not like that. No man wants to stop like that." "No man?" Paragon laughed again, the sound breaking and going high. "Oh, I have known a few that did not want to stop, that did want to stop, and I have known a few that did stop, and it ended the same whether they wanted to or not." So we see a little breaking of Paragon's madness coming out in Brashen's point of view here. We got a little bit inside of Paragon's mind, and he, yes, wandered from violent thoughts, but mostly fairly contained when we were in his head.
Right.
But we see a little outside perspective of how odd he can be.
Yes. And just from what we know from reading in his perspective up into this, I think it's just the leap from thinking about how cruel men can be and then having Brashen complain that there's no other choice left to him, and just this dark spiral of, well, of course there's a choice I don't get to make, and men are always so careless with others, and just that same talking point that is in his head always of these dark thoughts he doesn't really want to think about. And it is a really dark place to end this section on.
Right.
But it's something that Paragon really struggles with. It continues on, and it really makes me think about how being a pirate ship affected him as a live ship.
Yeah. A lot of death around him.
Yeah.
And a lot of death in this section in general. Death that's talked about. And it's very heavily foreshadowed and centered around the butcher boats, which Brashen links up with later, and then we know Althea jumps on as well.
Yes.
So that kind of sets up the danger in those sections.
Right. And a part that we kind of skimmed over is just talking about how the sea is really cruel. Like, there is just death at sea, and that's expected, but especially on these ships that Brashen is going for, that even if he isn't thrown overboard by a 2-packed deck, that there is the potential that if he gets a cut on his hand, it will infect and he'll lose his arm or his life. There just is so much that can go wrong on these boats.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of Althea, we kind of jump over to her perspective, where she is selling her earrings that her father got for her birthday one year. She's bartering and trying to get as much money for them as possible because she knows she has to start her life anew here. Ends up going higher than she wanted, or higher than than her minimum was, which she's grateful for. She says a half hour of bargaining later, she left his shop. 2 simple silver hoops had replaced the earrings her father had given her on her 13th birthday. She tried not to think of them as anything other than a possession she had sold. She still had the memory of her father giving them to her. She did not need the actual jewelry. They would only have been 2 more things to worry about. And she thinks about her material things, that it's, odd to take something for granted. And she's like looking around the market at these different things. A very nice set of combs is way out of her price range now, when just a couple days ago she would have been like, oh, that's nice.
Right.
Let's grab that.
Yeah, it's definitely eye-opening for her to have to live in a way where she can't just put something to her father's credit. That she actually has to think about the money she has and spend it wisely. And I also do want to point out that when she is bartering for her earrings, she is using really good bartering techniques. She talks about how the man offers her 17 gold and she gets him up to 19 by watching his face and then gets the hoops by watching his face when she says, I can do 19. And in seeing that he is super excited to get a deal, sweetens it for herself by adding more on top. So I just think it goes to show that there is some talent in Althea, that like she did actually learn stuff from her father. And I think I wanted to point that out just because the last chapter was, and I think some of the chapters before are just so heavy on Althea doesn't actually know anything. She isn't good for anything. She didn't learn anything. She's just a wild woman.
Well, I think we can both agree at least that she knows tasks. She's just never had to do them in an actual way, like working way.
Right. She wasn't like given shifts.
Right.
Yeah. No, but I do think that like seeing her competency, it's just like another little hint of she was learning things from her father and that she is actually seems somewhat talented at what she's doing.
Yeah.
She's capable.
She takes the money she got from those earrings, buys some essential things, and as I said, is walking around that market looking at all of these lavish things that she can no longer afford. She specifically says, suddenly some goods were far beyond her means, not just lavish fabrics or rich jewelry, but things as simple as a lovely set of combs. And I repeated this part because simple things as a lovely set of combs is a very privileged,
right,
trust fund baby kind of thing.
Right.
I'm not even talking about, Gucci and a tiara full of diamonds or anything. I'm just talking about like a Rolex. Something useful.
Yeah, there's definitely that sense of privilege coming through.
Just kind of funny. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think it's really interesting because from there, she really takes the time to indulge that thought of, well, what if I did go back and I put on really nice dresses and I lived this privileged life again? And then the moment passes and she realizes that she wouldn't really like that. That sure, those things are nice and she enjoys them, but not at the cost they come with, and it's not worth it to her. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do, because she hasn't really known a ton of hardship in her life that we know of up until this point. So the fact that she is sitting here saying, I'm willing to give that life up because I would prefer to live as who I truly am rather than be forced to be someone I'm not, even if that means I give up the good stuff too.
Right.
I don't know. I just find that very admirable, even if it is a little naive at this point. But she doesn't ever really go back on that.
Mm-hmm. This next passage here is something that is really weird for me to read, and it doesn't quite feel like it fits in, but at the same time, it's one of the most realistic things I've ever read a character do, where she daydreams about like, what about this event if my family found the chest that I got their gifts in or whatever, and they see that and they're like, oh no, she thought of gifts for us and everything like that. It's so realistic of like, what if this event happened, and you're thinking through all these different things and you have to push out like, no, whatever, it won't happen, it's fine, I'll just move on with my day.
Right.
I don't know, I say it's weird to read because like it kind of flows from the previous thought, but I don't know if it's just how the break was written in between the two passages, but to me it's like she's putting out her, this is the wealthy Althea. This is, the previous trader's daughter, Althea. That's out of my mind. And then it goes into imagining this whole thing with like her mother and her sister finding her chest and being like, oh, she did care for us.
I think that part is one of my more favorite moments with Althea, although it's not a nice way to think and it's very petty and childish. I think it, like you said, is very relatable of like, it feels like I'm such a good person. I'm pushing away this temptation and look at me, I'm growing. And then to be like, oh, I wish somebody else that knew me could see how well I'm doing. And then from there be like, oh, I bet they're going to open my chest and just be so sorry for how horrible they treated me.
She wondered if her sister and mother would shed a tear or two over the gifts from the daughter and sister they'd allowed to be driven away. She smiled a hard smile and set the combs back on the merchant's tray. She's like, no time for such daydreams. I got surviving to do.
Right. I don't know. I think it is very funny. And
yeah, it's funny, realistic. I like it a lot too. It just, I don't know. It's something, I don't know if it's just something that I don't read in fantasy pretty much ever, but it's such a, not daydreams in general, but it's such a mundane daydream.
Yes.
That it's like, I don't know. It's very realistic, but it almost brought me out because I don't see it.
It feels very much like a shower thought. Like I'm going to imagine the way I could have won this fight better, but instead of that, it's looking forward to the future of like, what if this happens while I'm not there to see it?
Althea definitely sits in the bath and thinks about comebacks to Kyle and different ways
oh
to
my
insult
gosh, yeah,
him.
absolutely she does. And she like probably fist pumps herself for being so good with that one. That one comeback that she just thought of.
She hyped herself up. I'm going to be calm this time. I'm going to say this whenever he says this. And then she goes in and starts yelling at him immediately.
Yep. Mood relatable.
So she reaffirms to herself that she's not going to go crawling back home. For contrary to Brashen Trell's stupid advice, she was not going to go crawling home again like some helpless, spoiled girl. No, that would only prove that everything Kyle had said about her was true. She straightened her spine and moved with renewed purpose through the market. She buys some simple food things, only things that would last for the day. Some flint and steel, 2 candles. She bought some things before for, a pouch and some shears for fabric, things like that. So she has her essentials. She doesn't really know what else she can do in town, but she is reluctant to leave as well. So she's wandering the market further a little bit more, greeting those who recognized her and accepting their condolences on the loss of her father. It no longer stung when they mentioned him. Instead, it was a part of the conversation to get past, an awkwardness. She did not want to think of him, nor to discuss with relative strangers the grief she felt at her loss. Least of all did she want to be drawn into any conversation that might mention her rift with her family. And she's kind of wondering how many people know about it. The servants are eventually going to talk, but she knows that Kyle won't mention it at all.
Right. And I feel really bad for Althea in this because it's clear that she misses her father and just companionship in general. I'm sure she in some ways misses her mom and sister too. She can't admit it. And the fact that she wants to stay around people, she wants to be around life, and she is like wandering around a little bit aimlessly to do so is really interesting. Instead of just going back and talking to Paragon or finding work right away, she's just kind of enjoying this moment of having people around. And I'm sure also it's a way to distract herself. She talks about how the grief for her father isn't as sharp anymore, but more so because she just wants to not think about it right now. Yeah. She's tired of being upset about it, which is really relatable. I feel like whenever you're in the midst of grief, there just sometimes becomes this point where you're like, okay, I just don't want to be sad right now. Like, I'm tired of being upset about this thing that happened. Like, I just want to pretend it didn't. Right. And I think that's like somewhat part of healing, but yeah,
she definitely is kind of thinking about that loneliness, not in those specific terms, but not having people to rely on. And once again talks about how she has withdrawn herself from Bingtown society without really meaning to, but also kind of meaning to.
Right.
how she doesn't really recognize anybody, that many people in general, so she doesn't have to talk to that many people. But the only other people that really know her are the merchants and the brokers that she followed her father around and met with them
Right.
on his behalf. Any other woman her age would have attended at least 6 gatherings in the last 6 months, balls and galas and other festivities. She had not even been to even one since, the harvest ball. Her sailing schedule had not allowed it, and the balls and dinners had seemed unimportant then, something she could return to whenever she wished. Gone now. Gone, done and gone. Dresses sewn for her with slippers to match, painting her lips and scenting her throat. Swallowed up in the sea with her father's body. The grief she had thought she had numbed suddenly clutched at her throat. She turned and hurried off, up one street and down another. She blinked her eyes furiously, refusing to let the tears flow. When she had herself under control, she slowed her step and looked around her. And she's facing Amber's shop.
Right.
So yeah, like you were saying, it is totally normal in the midst of some horrible event to be like, I don't want to be sad right now. And then also totally normal to have some random stray thought just kind of worm its way into your head and then be overwhelmed once again.
Right. And that's the thing that brings you back of like, oh yeah, there's death and I'm sad. And I think that's really well done. I think it's also well done to again reiterate how not a part of Bingtown Althea is. And I've given Althea criticism for not really caring about what goes on in the land holdings and what goes on while she's away. I don't think it's great that she doesn't care, but it is really interesting to see the society that kind of let her get away, that people aren't really trying to keep in contact with her, that it was easy for her to step away from society and kind of be forgotten.
To be fair, there's not much they can do to get in contact with her when she's sailing.
Well, sure, no, but
for probably 10 months of the year.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that there is, but I don't know. I just think it paints a really interesting picture of a mutual agreement to let go of.
Yeah, if you don't make the effort in this society, you are going to be left behind. If you don't attend these social gatherings, you're not going to be in the know for everything. You're not going to be kept up on your friendships, your gossip.
Right.
And if she only goes to one thing a year, that's really rough.
Right.
Especially if there's at least one a month.
That's fair. And I mean, I can't imagine she gets along well with a ton of the other girls. So
that's fair.
Yeah.
So she is rushing away, trying to cover up her grief, not break down in the middle of the street, and ends up standing right in front of Amber's shop. She could not think of why she could feel threatened by a jeweler, but she did. The woman was not even a trader, not even a proper jeweler. She carved wood in Sa's name, wood, and sold it as jewelry. In that instant, Althea suddenly decided she would see this woman's goods for herself. With the same resolution as if grasping a nettle, she pushed open the door and swept into the shop.
Right. So clearly this is a misdirection of feelings. Like she doesn't want to grapple with the death of her father, so she's going to use anger to get out. She's going to be mad at Amber just because. It's not really a good enough reason. Like she's different, so I'm angry.
Yeah, true.
But she goes in and I think she's kind of expecting to be right, that there's no way this person could have anything good enough to have gained a spot on this old traders selling street on her own. Like everybody's hyped it up too much and she's going to be the truth sayer to come in and point at it and be like, see, it's not that good. And she's proven wrong.
Yeah. She describes the whole shop with words of like, it's not even just jewelry. It's a bunch of things, goblets, cups, bowls, combs, scented wood. There's even a huge chair carved from one big bowl of wood, all this things. And she says it's very remarkable, even like the person who is sitting in the chair who she did not see at first.
Right.
Because her eyes just kind of glanced over because Amber is sitting there and Amber has clothes on that match the tone of her skin, which match the grain of the wood. So it's kind of camouflage, basically.
Right. And it is really interesting. She mentions that most, if not all, of the pieces that are made in this shop are made out of one piece of wood, that there's no joining pieces, there's no seams anywhere, which I thought was really interesting because I mean, I don't know a lot about woodworking, but I do know that that's really hard to do. To use one piece of wood for the entirety of a project and do it well.
Right. Yeah.
So there's definitely this little bit of awe that comes over her. And then we have Amber.
She raises one eyebrow quizzically at Althea. You wish to see me? She asked quietly. No, Althea exclaimed both truthfully and reflexively. Then she made an effort to recover, saying haughtily, I was but curious to see this wooden jewelry that I had heard so much about. You being such a connoisseur of fine wood, Amber nodded. There was almost no inflection to Amber's words. A threat? A sarcasm? A simple observation? Althea could not decide. And suddenly it was too much that this woodworker, this artisan, would dare speak to her so. She was, by saw, the daughter of a Bingtown trader. A Bingtown trader herself by right, and this woman, this upstart, was no more than a newcomer to their settlement who had dared to claim a spot for herself on Rainwild Street. All Althea's frustration and anger of the past week suddenly had a target. You refer to my live ship, Althea rejoined. It was all in the tone, the challenge as to what right this woman had to speak of her ship at all. Have they legalized slavery here in Bingtown? Again, there was no real expression to read in that fine-featured face. Amber asked the question as if it flowed naturally from Althea's last words. Of course not. Let the Chalcidians keep their base customs. Bingtown will never acknowledge them as right. Ah, but then, the briefest of pauses, you did refer to the live ship as yours. Can you own another living, intelligent creature? Vivacia is mine as I speak of my sister as mine. Family. Althea threw down the words. She could not have said why she suddenly felt so angry. Family, I see. Amber flowed upright. She was taller than Althea had expected. Not pretty, much less beautiful, but there was still something arresting about her. Her clothing was demure, her carriage graceful. The finely pleated fabric of her robe echoed the fine plaits in her hair. Her appearance shared her carving simplicity and elegance. Her eyes met Althea's and held them. You claim sisterhood with wood. A smile touched the corners of her lips, making Amber's mouth suddenly mobile, generous. Perhaps we have more in common than I dared to hope. Continues from there, but that is an interesting passage to start with. Althea, as you said, is kind of directing all of her anger from the past weeks, and as Althea says, all of her anger from the past weeks towards Amber and this presumptuous upstart who is asking her about her live ship.
Yeah, it's definitely a way for Althea to blow off steam, it feels like. There's this misdirected anger. But
we know Amber is up to that challenge.
True. We also know Amber is not the best person to come to when you're feeling a little angsty, because Amber is not going to like baby you or be nice.
True.
And I really find it interesting to know that Amber is the fool and to read this, because I can just pick up on the fool thinking about how the next move will be played. Almost, I feel like thinking of it like a game and having fun, even if it doesn't show on her face that she's having fun. I feel like wordplay is still her forte.
Yeah, true. And you can kind of divine her feelings towards towards Althea, and her trying to get to the bottom of her feelings towards her live ship. That was her main goal,
right?
Pretty much. And probably why kind of anger she had towards her, like the disdain on her face from previous comments with Brashen. So she wants to know if she does claim ownership of Vivacia. First of all, like that's kind of the main point of it, and then warms considerably towards her when Althea's like, no, she's family to me, she's mine, like I have my brother or my sister, you know.
Right.
So Amber hearing that is like, okay, you're not just using this intelligent creature that I'm upset it exists because it proves the existence of dragons, but also like,
right.
I don't know. Again, we don't know if she knows for sure.
Right. I do wonder, though, if these feelings of mistreatment or like the fear of mistreatment of the live ships stems from her knowledge of how the wit works. That
could be.
She knows animals are intelligent because she has literally spoken to an animal before, and knows that there are people who would use intelligent creatures to their betterment against the creature's will. And I think even herself in her past has been used in that way. And so
that's true.
She probably just really feels for the live ships, especially because they're prisoners in a way that animals cannot be, and that she herself could not have been. They're trapped. They're made out of wood and they have to be in the water.
Yeah.
And so I think probably all that combined makes her a little bit wary of somebody who would use the live ships for their own gain, regardless of the feelings of the live ship.
True. But now that Althea is claiming a family with the live ship instead, Amber warms up considerably, and now we get into the typical, very
playful,
but also very opaque wordings that Beloved is known for, and especially as somebody who has never encountered Amber or the Fool or any of those iterations, has no idea what she's talking about. And she says, we have more in common than I dared hope. Althea's like, you hoped? Why would you hope that we had anything in common at all? And the smile widens a little bit. And Amber replies, because it would make things easier for both of us. And as a rereader, and as somebody outside of this story, I'm like, because she needs to work with you, because you're her catalyst now.
Right. But also just the habit of the Fool of not answering any questions.
Yeah.
The book, of Howl's Moving Castle, describes Howl as a slitherer outer, because Howl himself can never answer a question straight on. And anytime I read The Fool, I think of that description. The Fool is just a slitherer outer. And it's so funny how they can't just answer a question normal. They gotta really make you work for it. And I don't know. I really appreciate that about The Fool. I think it makes things more entertaining. And I think especially because it's riling up Althea in a way where she's like, what kind of game is this person playing? And Fool's like, the best one.
And Althea refuses to respond to that or rise to anything. And eventually Amber breaks and sighs and is like, oh, you're such a stubborn girl.
Right.
Although I kind of admire that about you.
Right. I do wonder, I don't know, I guess, did Fitz ever really refuse to play the game? Only if he was angry, right?
Only if he was like incredibly angry with the Fool specifically. Because they have been friends for a long time and like would talk to each other when they were kids. So I don't think that ever really happened. They grew up together, so he wasn't established as like a stubborn person that wouldn't do anything with the Fool.
Right. I guess I was just wondering, because I was wondering if Althea kind of reminds Amber of Starling, or if it's a little bit of Fitz.
Probably sees a little bit of both, but like stubbornness kind of runs through our main characters in all of these Robin Hobb books.
Yes.
So
I don't know. But yeah, so there is that. I also do want to just quickly, as an aside, I feel like it's really interesting how Amber chooses to dress and present herself. It kind of reminds me of Ketrican. There's this like austere gracefulness that is,
it's fair.
Not, the beauty isn't necessarily captured by gaudiness, that there's just this simplicity and it's still womanly. And there's the plaited hair, like I imagine Ketrican likes to wear her hair. So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting that Amber deciding to be a woman kind of resembles probably a woman that she very much respects.
Spent a lot of time in the company of Ketrican over the years.
And the mountain people.
Yeah, and the mountain people.
Yeah.
So Amber and Althea are sitting here kind of in a standoff in Althea's mind. In Amber's mind, it's like, I'm trying to like gauge this
Right. I
person.
don't. She's like,
So-
I don't want to make it too tough yet.
Right. So Althea's like, did you follow me down when I saw you on the docks? And Amber's like, no, but the thought had crossed my mind that you had followed me because I was there first. And Althea's like, but the way you were looking at me, I do not want to say that you lie, but you seem to be looking for me, watching me. Amber nodded slowly, more to herself than to the girl. So it seemed to me also. And yet it was not you at all that I went seeking. She toyed with her earrings, setting first the dragon and then the serpent to swinging. I went to the docks looking for a 9-fingered slave boy, if you can credit that. She smiled oddly. You are what found me instead. There is coincidence and there is fate. I am more than willing to argue with coincidence, but the few times I have argued with fate, I have lost. Badly. She shook her head, setting all 4 of her mismatched earrings to swaying. Her eyes seemed to look inward, recalling other times. Then she looked up and met Althea's curious gaze, and once more her smile softened her face. But that is not true for all folk. Some folk are meant to argue with fate, and win. So, another little break there. I'll pause and discuss that. So we have Amber following some intuition of hers, going down to the docks, probably some vision or, whatever, going down to the docks to look for a 9-fingered slave boy who we know is Wintro.
Right.
He turns into Wintro, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle cuts off his finger. He becomes a slave because of Kyle.
Right.
And then eventually Amber comes face to face with him later, and she has like mutterings to herself of like, did I choose to follow the wrong person? Basically.
Right.
And she finds Althea instead, and then meets Althea's gaze and is like, I argued with fate, I can't win that. But some people can argue with fate and win, which obviously in her mind is Fitz. And now she's looking at Althea like catalyst.
Right. What I find really interesting about this is I wonder if Althea and Wintro were interchangeable the whole time, like they both were capable of being catalysts, or or if Althea never was a catalyst. And
I think they are both catalysts. I am of the opinion that the Fool or Amber or Beloved does not have to be there for the catalyst to exist.
right.
The White Prophet's job is to try to guide them to use the catalyst to steer them to the vision of the future that they see.
Right.
Right? So Wintro, I think, is a catalyst, and he makes the decisions he does that helps that side of the story
Right.
come to fruition. And it eventually leads to dragons as we know it. But Amber, when she sees him, like, did I follow the wrong person? Was I supposed to guide him instead
Right.
of guiding Althea? Like all these different kinds of thoughts. So I think they're both catalysts. They both have decisions. And honestly, it's really hard to the who is the catalyst and who is not is so hard to discuss and find out for real, because the
Right.
only person we know who is a catalyst for sure is Fitz.
Right.
There are a lot of thoughts on who B's catalyst is, but I won't get into that now. But for sure, the only one we know 100% is Fitz.
Well, I do think a little
and Kebble Rawbread. Sorry,
right. Definitely. I do think a little bit about in the last trilogy when B and Fool meet for the first time before they're ripped apart. I think about how the Fool points out that every person has the capacity to change fate's weave, but sometimes those decisions are so minute and you have to be the one to push them on that minute path to make a difference. Whereas someone like Fitz makes a decision that wasn't even an option.
Because he wasn't supposed to be alive.
Right. And so I think...
I see Fitz as like a super catalyst.
Yeah. I think of it as, I definitely think there are tiers. I think everyone has the capacity to be a catalyst in some ways. I just think some ways are more mundane than others.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not important. It just means that you don't really have to care about every single person you're coming in contact with as much as you have to care about the big ones because their ripples are longer reaching.
Yes, yeah, I could. The reason I brought up the who is the catalyst, who is not, I could argue that Kenneth is the biggest catalyst in this series,
Interesting.
in
Okay.
this trilogy at least. His decisions make a lot of the other decisions worth something,
That's fair.
But like all of them are intertwined in some way. So like it's hard to put a value on something.
No, definitely. And it is really hard to tell like what makes a catalyst, what doesn't, like you
Right.
said. So yeah, it's hard to see.
So Amber is obviously, and at least in my mind, is obviously thinking, Althea's the one I need to influence. She has some play in this. Some people can face fate and win, and then offers a bowl of beads to Althea. Select one. I want to give you a gift. Take whichever one you want.
Right. Which is kind of a test. But I do want to say I think it's interesting because we know Althea and Wintrow look remarkably similar.
Yeah.
I think it's noted in the last trilogy how alike they look. Kenneth remarks on it, and
in the last book.
Yeah,
trilogy? Yeah.
The last book, Kenneth remarks about it. Amber remarks on it. I think even Althea and Wintrow themselves remark on it
In this book, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think at this moment in time they look as similar, but they're getting.
No, I remember she does make a mention of how they look similar in one of the passages. I think
Right.
when they're in the room and Kyle punches Wintrow, I think it's that one.
Yes.
And he's like arguing and looks at her and he's like, "Oh, I see some of my looking past the Haven features. I see some of my father's resolve and some of me even, that sort of stuff."
Right. Because we know that Althea looks more like her father.
Right.
So, yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to think about, too, that maybe the reason the line is blurred is because they do look so similar that maybe I don't know. It's hard because we don't know if they know what the catalyst looks like.
Right.
So who knows? Maybe Amber thinks that she's gotten to Althea before she becomes the 9-figured slave boy.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. Time is weird.
She does help her become a quote unquote boy, I guess,
right,
for the ship.
Teaches her how to become a boy to survive. But I do also have one quick question for you. So when Amber talks about how some people cannot fight fate, that she herself has tried and failed, and then looks to the distance, what instance do you think she's talking about?
I'm not sure. I think it's I think it's specifically about King Shrewd trying to prevent his death in some way, or prevent, Fitz from killing him or something,
Right.
whatever it was, some past regret like that. But I don't know.
That's
what were you
interesting.
thinking?
I didn't have any idea. Well, especially because she talks about how some people can fight against fate and win. So it couldn't have been anything that happens to Fitz, like trying to keep him from getting beat up in the dungeons. I don't think it would be that. But I don't know. I was like, what could have possibly? I don't even remember a single thing that the Fool tried to fix. But
King Shrewd was the Fool's kind of obsession, and truly someone who cared for him before anybody else did,
right,
as a person, and tried so hard to tell Fitz, lay off, like, he's gonna die, don't hasten it, like, don't do anything.
Right.
So I don't know.
And to be
just
fair,
leave the old man be, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Haven't you done enough?
To be fair, if he would have let Fitz do what he wanted to begin with, maybe Fitz would have figured out that he was getting his life force sucked away earlier.
And
so
maybe that's why the Fool is thinking, like, people can't, everyone can't fight fate,
Right.
I don't know.
Interesting. I don't know.
That was my first thought about it, at least.
I like it. Either way, now the test has begun, and Althea has to pick a bead, and she talks about how she's looking at this bowl of little beads. They're about the size of the top half of her thumb, and they're so intricate, and each of them is so sincerely whatever it is that they're carved that you can't imagine they could ever be anything else. Like the dolphin is obviously a dolphin, and the apple is definitely an apple. There's
And that
no
piece of wood couldn't hold any other kind of shape to it because that's what it was meant to be.
right, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I wonder if it's a little bit of skill being left over and Althea picking up that lingering sense of skill.
Maybe.
I don't know, because I would assume that she's somewhat sensitive to it. And we know that Amber is carving these with her hands. I mean, probably with a knife too, but I feel like her hands are doing most of the work.
Althea can't really choose because all of them are so nice and beautiful, and she's kind of somewhat suspicious still, so she asks Amber why she's giving her a gift. And Amber wants to be her friend. Althea's like, why? And Amber replies, because I can see that you go through life athwart it. You see the flow of events, you are able to tell how you could most easily fit yourself into it, but you dare to oppose it. And why? Simply because you look at it and say, this fate does not suit me. I will not allow it to befall me. Amber shook her head, but her small smile made it an affirmation. I have always admired people who can do that. So few do. Many, of course, will rant and rave against the garment fate has woven for them, but they pick it up and don it all the same, and most wear it to the end of their days. You would rather go naked into the storm. Again the smile, fading as quickly as it blossomed. I cannot abide that you should do that. So I offer you a bead to wear. And Althea's like, you sound like a fortune teller. Which is pretty funny.
Right.
But at that moment, it kind of rushes past before Amber can respond because she finds her bead at the bottom, just grabbing onto something and knows instantly that that's the one that she wants, even though she hasn't seen it. She picks it up and it is an egg.
Right. And I think this is another point in this book where magic seems weird to me. I don't know a better way to phrase it, but essentially like Kenneth, where he just happens to be very lucky, but in the like most absurd ways. We also have this moment of serendipity almost where she touches a bead and knows it's hers from that instant. And it just so happens when she pulls it out that Amber smiles, and that's the serpent egg.
Right.
And it's just so weird to me. It's so mystical and magical. And I think that's something that this book has that the last book doesn't. Like, yes, there is magic in the world, the Fitz world. Obviously, we're still in that world, but there's magic in the first trilogy, but it doesn't feel like this wondrous big thing.
We feel it, we see it used nefariously in the first one.
That's fair. Yeah.
Or reviled. So something that is kind of like, wow, look at that. It just kind of fits perfectly. Is pretty unique to the realm of the Elderlings so far.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know. It really like makes the magic kind of stick out for me more, I think.
Interesting. I don't like it because it's inconsistent. I like the feeling it brings.
Yes.
But I don't like that. I like that it expands everything, but there's not a specific reasoning for it. We could put something on it like, 99% of the paths she grabs, or like 50% of the paths she grabs this one, and 50% of the paths she grabs this one, and Amber knows which one she wants her to grab. So when she grabs the egg, it's like, that's the perfect one. But it doesn't make sense why Althea would be drawn to that specific bead.
Right.
Because in her head, it's like, she instantly knows.
Right.
I don't know. It's so, I don't know. It's weird.
No, I wasn't trying to say that I like it.
Yeah.
I just think it makes it more vibrant. And
it does. It definitely does. It brings life to the world a little bit more. And all of the incredibly magic things that we see from the Rainwild,
right.
The different gems that glow colors and all the different
Scented
descriptions
gems.
of toys, all the other island pieces that kind of picks up. All of those different little things are completely mystical compared to everything else we've seen so far.
Right. And I guess I like that. I do. I just like it separate from the world that we're supposedly in.
Right.
I think,
yeah.
like you said. But that is where we are now. So that is what we must focus on. And Althea is left pondering
the egg, basically.
Yeah, basically.
looking at it, saying it's of a warm brown wood. It has holes in it to be worn on a bracelet. And Amber, like you said before, smiles and like, yeah, that's the serpent's egg. You can definitely have that. Althea's like, you want nothing in return? And Amber says, in return, I only ask that you allow me to help you. Allow you to help me what? She smiled. Thwart fate.
Yeah.
So now she has Althea on her hook.
Yes, she's won her over with an egg. However, I do think it's really interesting, Amber's whole talk of fate and that some people can see the stream of fate and fight against it. I think especially because, as we just talked, we kind of talked about how Fitz is a super catalyst in our mind, but I don't think Fitz ever thinks about the flow of fate and fights against it. And I mean, in ways he does, but not in like a conscious, I don't feel like it's the same way Althea is doing it. Like Althea is seeing like, this is a man's world, and to succeed, I need to be a docile woman, and that's dumb, and I don't agree with it, so I'm going to work really hard to prove you don't have to do that to succeed. Whereas Fitz is like, I see that like life as a royal is really hard, and I would way prefer to not do that, but I'm not really going to step away from it. In ways that I can, I will, but I'm still going to do stuff what people ask me to do.
I both agree and disagree with you.
Okay.
Because, like we mentioned before, Fitz is a different sort of catalyst.
Right.
And where his very existence is improbable. So any choice he makes kind of changes what's happening.
That's fair.
But so yeah, that is definitely a difference between Althea's more active role of like, I'm choosing to do this against conventions.
Right.
But I don't agree with you that I don't agree with like that the whole tone of that argument where it's like Althea's fighting injustice in the patriarchy kind of thing. Because I think Althea literally is just like, I just want to sail. I don't give a crap about anybody else. I don't think she's doing it for some whole like proving other people wrong. I think she literally just wants her ship. You know, and that's, yeah, proving Kyle wrong, sure. But I don't see her crusading for everything. Just the same as Fitz is not like, I'm here to show that all royals suck or anything. He's like, I just want to retire and go to a farm.
That's
like
fair.
I think their whole worldviews are much more mundane and centered on themselves and their own personal wants.
Right.
And it just so happens that all of their decisions kind of affect the wider world around them. Excuse me. So I don't fully agree that it's like this grand choice versus Fitz being like, no, I just don't want to. But they are different in certain ways that you mentioned as well. So like I'm halfway there.
Right. I guess I'm not trying to say that Althea is like pushing the cause. She's like feminist number one in the city. Like she definitely is just doing it for herself. I don't think she's trying to like get other women to do the same.
Yeah.
But I do think that I was just trying to use it more as like a picture of like there is a more laid out role that makes sense. Whereas like being a royal is so ambiguous and like, what does that really mean? And being a bastard child is extremely ambiguous because there are a lot of paths to take on that.
Yeah.
And Fitz doesn't like the one that he's on, but he doesn't necessarily make a whole bunch of changes to get on the one that he does want to be on. Whereas Althea is like, this is what I want to do and nobody else approves of it and I'm doing it anyway. Just like
so the first thing, like active versus just being alive.
Just passive. Yeah. Yeah. Where I feel like, so that descriptor of the fools of like, you see the flow of fate and you're choosing to go against it doesn't feel like it fits for Fitz to me.
Although I specifically, in my mind, the end of book 1 in The Mountain Kingdom, where he specifically tries to go against Regal and thwart like the whole poisoning of Rurisk and goes against his king, even when he like connected with the skill and got an answer from Justin. It was like, hey, no, this is what or August was it? It's like, no, this is what he wants. He said, just listen to Regal. Fitz still goes against all of those reasonings and like, no, this isn't right. I need to, work this out with Rurisk. I need to say that, like, tell them about the poisoning and stuff like that.
Right.
So for some things, yes. And for most of his like daily life, yes. But there are big decisions that I think Fitz does actively take his own like wants into consideration and does them. But not as often as Althea because of the just being alive thing.
Right. True. Okay. Fair enough. I'll accept that.
Overall, I agree with your reasoning on that, though. I think there are a couple instances where Fitz does
Actively see the
especially
flow.
in the later books.
Yeah, definitely later.
Yes.
I just think
in the first trilogy, a few big instances, but mostly it's just him being
it's
around.
very passive. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the later ones, he definitely takes a big like.
Yeah,
this is how things are happening.
Yeah, it does feel like Fitz takes more control later. I think comparing the Fitz we have just read to Althea now, it's like
a little bit of a difference. Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, even if we take into consideration Wintrow and who Wintrow is, he also sees the flow of fate and sees how much easier it would be just to be on a ship and to become a ship's boy and to devote himself to the ship, the family ship. Mm-hmm. And instead he's saying, no, I would rather be a priest. I think there's value in being book smart rather than world wise.
Right. And speaking of Wintrow, our next section is about Wintrow, but we are going to cut it there. I know we have a lot to cover, and we've covered a lot in this chapter. This chapter kind of goes over all of the perspectives that we have, except for Kenneth's.
And Paragon.
Well, yeah, I guess. But he's not like a main character.
Also, what's her name? Veronica.
She's in this one.
Oh, that's true. You're right.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind.
Although it's from Vivacia's point of view, I think. So
there.
It's kind of, whatever. She's in it though. But yeah, we had a couple more sections to cover, so we'll cut it there for now, and we will continue this discussion next week of this chapter. But so far, we've had some interesting talks about, the characters in general, about Brashen, a little bit of redemption for Althea and her competency with bargaining.
Yes.
But also a resurgence of her petty anger.
Yes, her childishness, which, I mean, I don't know. She's a late teenager. I'll give her,
emotional turmoil, death in the family, her father, grief. I get it.
I don't know. It's really fun to read the series, though. And I do think something that's really hard about this series that wasn't as hard last series is that with the amount of people, I feel like it's taking us way longer to go through each chapter because I feel like there's more to dig into. There's more to talk about and more that I want to talk about in depth because it's not just the same person over and over again. Yeah. It's not just the same. I'm not hearing the same person talk this whole time and having to talk about the same thing over and over again. It's reminding us of so this is where they're coming from and this is what happened last time. And
time passes too.
Yeah.
So we get a little bit more plot moving forward with so many moving parts.
I do feel a little bit bad that we're kind of taking a long time to go through, but
I think it'll speed up later on as things kind of focus in their directions and we have a kind of grasp of the people and we're done setting up. Remember, we're still only in chapter 13.
That's true.
Of the first book. Maybe halfway. I haven't checked how long this book is, really. I'll check right now.
You right now. 36 is the last chapter.
Okay, so we're a third of the way in almost, or a little bit over a third of the way in. But we're just kind of in the setup right now. So, and I know you were super worried about reading the live ships, or didn't want to read the live ships the first time through because you didn't want to leave Fitz.
Yeah.
And Night Eyes.
No, I definitely see the appeal of why some people who don't like Fitz love this series and following the Rainwild Trader Chronicles and just everything in general. I think you can definitely tell they do feel like different series. I mean, they are technically, but you know what I mean? It's different books. It feels like they could be if you wanted them to be. So.
100%. This is it's a lot faster paced than the original trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, But also there are people who do the opposite. They only read the Fitz books and skip these ones.
Which I also totally get, because this is a very different vibe.
But also, to all of you people who have skipped either of the books, stop listening to us. We're spoiling everything. Unless you don't care to read them, I suppose. But you should. Read them all. They're fantastic. And they all kind of, as we've been discussing, they all kind of lend into one another and mirror thoughts and have threads running through all of these different books. And Robin Hobb kind of wrote them in one big tapestry here.
Yeah. Do you really think anybody is listening to this podcast who hasn't read all the books?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, please write in if you have not read all the books and you're listening anyway. Would love to hear from you.
Yeah. I guess we have said a few warnings before, like we're going to spoil all the books. So maybe there's not. I don't know.
I guess I definitely listen to spoiler podcasts if I like the host. So maybe people just like us.
That can't be it.
No, probably not.
So let us know at isfitshappy@gmail.com, where you can email us, or you can message us on any of our social medias. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram at isfitshappy. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hope to hear from you.
See you next week. Okay, so we have a couple things to talk about here at the end. Some things that our listeners have brought up for us. I think we'll start first with Facebook. And we got a comment from Ellen just asking a very valid question. How do memories for live ships work?
Yeah, something I've thought about, but specifically with our first part of this being like the logbook thing is weird.
Right. So Ellen's very confused about how the memories work, as am I believe. But the whole idea that they're made out of these cocoons, that the whole function of is keeping memories in, and yet
basically the dragons hatch out, they eat the cocoons and get the previous, like the memories from the dragon who spit with the sand to create the cocoon.
Right. That there's some sort of memory drawing from there. How that is not affected by logbooks when they're dragons, but somehow whenever they're a ship, maybe it is. Paragon specifically mentions that he thinks his memory is gone because his logbooks are gone.
That's what Brashen says too.
Yeah, Brashen had the idea first. But how is it? Why is that? Is it just because once they're turned into a ship, they're nothing more than a vessel and they're a tool and not supposed to be their own entity? And asks, so maybe Paragon's memories get harder to reach or even start to fade when he's alone for such long periods of time because of that. But maybe they need living beings to interact with the memories to keep them active. What are our thoughts? And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I don't think the logbooks affect the memory at all. I think that can't be right. I do think there's pretty good evidence in the text to let us know that memories are helped by the living beings. For instance, Paragon starts off not really remembering things, and he even tells Althea he doesn't know things, but with Althea and Brashen staying on board and talking with him, he is remembering old sayings and can hold conversations with things, and has remarked a couple times with the two of them, like, oh, I can't believe I remembered that. So I think it has everything to do with interacting with life and nothing to do with a book.
Yeah, there is something possibly that could be with the logbooks, but not the logbooks themselves. I think it would be the act of the captains, having a habit of noting down what happened during the day in the logbooks that Paragon would be aware of because of the connection with the captains,
Right.
So he would have that kind of link, that memory of them writing that down, kind of writing it into his actual memory, if you would, kind of like a computer, and just kind of etched there. And
Right.
without those, he can't easily recall the memories. Without the people, he can't bring up those memories because he doesn't recall what those past things were like, the interactions. So ultimately, I do side with that. The living things, I think, do help and bring things out. But I think the logbooks play into it just because of the habit of being on a ship. I think it's more of like the item was attached to recalling, those things. He could maybe with the logbooks there, he could be like, oh, this is where they sit. I remember him writing this down on this day, and this is what happened.
Maybe.
That's just my kind of thoughts on it. Cause it always pops up, but like, I never truly believed that the logbooks were magical in any way or hosted memories. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't know. It is.
Unless the pages were made out of wizard wood.
No, because I feel like that'd be way too valuable.
Yeah.
To like write on every day. No, I do think it's probably something to do with living beings. I mean, if you think about it, the cocoons themselves aren't the dragon, right? The dragon is being shielded by that, and they eat it. And so maybe without the life to breathe something into the memories, it does just start to fade. Maybe if you left a live ship alone for long enough without any living being on it, it would go back to just being wood.
Maybe long enough, yeah.
Yeah. I think it would still take a really long time.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. Like more than 3 generations to pass, long time.
Maybe like 1,000 years, kind of long time.
Although I don't know, maybe it would only take 3 generations, because 3 generations are what it takes to
maybe
to wake them. So and at least 1 generation has passed since Paragon has been beached, and he is starting to really forget his memories. And that's
how long are you judging? Well, I guess 30 years. Yeah, beached. That's a generation about. Okay, maybe, but
for
like
Paragon, that's less than 1 generation. Not to be sad.
I don't know. I feel like it would take longer than that because Paragon's still is still interactive. He still has emotions. He's still he might not remember things, but
that's also a live ship who isn't completely out of touch with living things.
Sure.
So
true.
I feel like part of it has to be that they're completely isolated, all alone, beached.
It'd be very cruel.
That would be horribly cruel.
Yeah. Interesting thought.
Yeah. Oh, I wonder if then you could wake it back up if you 3 people die on the deck again. New cycle. That's what they should have been trying with Paragon, honestly, since he was the crazy ship anyway. Not that I think that I don't actually, morally, I don't think they should have, but like logistically, they could have tried it. Maybe that's what they're going for. I don't know.
Maybe.
Anyway, thank you, Ellen, for bringing that question up. It's definitely something that I think we've both thought of, but have never talked about on the podcast. So it's fun to have that conversation here. Thank you.
We also had a message from Amir talking about the Paragon as well, but specifically his age and how he is probably about 100 years old-ish.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit older. Possibly he has a bunch of different ages in here and estimations. How 30 on the beach, 20 about when he was gone. So that's 50 there. About 8 estimated for 17 successful voyages before he disappeared. 2 years for Cable, 5 for beached after Otto had him, 2 after Otto's death, 20 for Otto and his father, which is about 85 to 90 years. And that's about 70 years before the events of the Farseer trilogy, and still before both Chade and Shrewd were born, and before any other event that has been talked about here. So very old being, and the live ships in general are probably the second oldest beings besides Icefire in this whole series.
Right.
Amir did say that maybe Paragon was the oldest beside Icefire, but there were other live ships that helped him readjust when he was awakened, when he came back in. So I don't think that's true.
Right.
Because I don't know if he I don't remember the history of him. I don't remember if he was the first carved and they used more, but he did not awaken first. So I'm counting age kind of a little bit different here because there were awakened live ships that helped him when he came back.
Right. And I mean, if you think about the fact that the 3 generations that had passed to create Paragon Awake were 3 short.
At once.
Yeah, two of them did happen at once, and one was a very short life, that maybe he would not be one of the first ones created. I have this weird feeling that Ophelia was the first live ship created. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, I'm not
but
sure.
But I feel like she might have been one of the first, at least.
I know she's older, but
the oldest.
Yeah,
or not the oldest, one of the oldest.
But there's also, so my thought was, of oldest beings in this thing, how old are the servants?
Oh yeah, they're like,
I thought they were like super long lived.
They might have been alive when dragons were still around, potentially.
Were they? Like, I have very vague memories of the last book. Were they originals of like, and they've been leading the Clerus for like a long time? Or were they like, see, I don't remember this part specifically about them because it's really, kind of breezed past.
It's really hard because I don't think they're originals because I don't think they are pure whites themselves.
No, yeah. Not originals as in like original whites or original white prophets or anything, but like I used the wrong word, but originals in the sense of, were they the ones that first were leading the school to the dark path to like manipulate bloodlines and stuff like that and had this vision? Or was that vision for the school passed down and these are just the latest iteration of leaders that have been there for 400 years or something? But either way, they'd be really old. And then there's also Prilkop.
Yes, Prilkop.
Who's like 600 or something at least. Like he's old.
I don't think he knows any of the current people in power though in the last book.
That's true.
Which would mean that they can't be older than him. Or if they are around the same age, they just weren't in power at the time. Yeah. So they can't be much older than him.
So just estimations, it's probably Icefire, Prilkop, some of the servants at the school, and the live ships.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we're talking like the stone dragons are living beings, and then it'd be the stone dragons and then Icefire, I would guess.
You think Icefire is less old than the stone dragons?
Yeah. Because the Elderlings were doing that before the downfall.
Fair enough.
It's possible Icefire was around longer, but
I don't know.
Yeah, it's something I never really thought about, like who's the oldest or who has been around for different periods before we even like learn about things. But it is weird to think about Paragon as being around and being carved and being awakened before Shrewd or Jade were alive, you know?
Yeah, that is a really like kind of freaky thing to think about.
And then he gets Fitz's face later with different colored eyes.
Mm-hmm.
With Kenneth's eyes.
Yeah, so thank you for that little fun tidbit, Amir. We always enjoy figuring out the fun things that you've put together for us. And thank you to everyone who's written in, whether or not we have talked about you on the pod. We are reading it and we love hearing from you guys. And I hope you guys are enjoying a spooky season this October. I feel like it'd be really fun if anybody does costumes or anything and is dressing up like a character for Halloween or a con or anything in the spirit of spooky time. We would love to see any of your costumes.
Yeah.
Especially ones that are centered around the series. So anyway, I hope you guys have a great day. And we'll see you guys next time.